Imagine reading a multi-trillion-dollar blueprint for planetary survival, right?
Okay.
But for thousands of years, everyone who picked it up just thought it was like a cosmic greeting card about rain and sheep.
Yeah. That is essentially what we're looking at today.
I mean, it's wild to think about. Today, you are joining us for a deep dive into a lecture from the Tulu Islam digital audio series. We are specifically looking at Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 15 through 22.
Right.
And traditionally, when you read these verses, they talk about falling rain, growing gardens, grazing cattle. The standard lens basically tells you to feel a sense of awe.
It's treated as poetry, almost.
Exactly. It points to these things as signs of power and says simply, be grateful.
Right. It frames the text as this comforting aesthetic experience. It's designed to soothe you.
Yeah.
Because, it is a very human tendency to want our foundational texts to just reassure us. We want to be told we are being looked after by a benevolent universe.
Totally.
But in doing that, it reduces these profoundly structural economic arguments to mere sentimentality.
And that is exactly what we are throwing out today.
Yeah.
The lecture we are diving into strips all of that sentimentality away entirely.
Completely.
We're going to look at this text strictly as master sociologists, or like systems engineers. Because the argument presented in this source material is that this is absolutely not a gratitude list.
Far from it.
It is a highly sophisticated economic argument. The text is establishing that the universe is a preloaded productive system. It contains every single material input a civilization needs to thrive.
And the ultimate test, really, is whether the human being, what the text actually calls the kalkan akar, which we'll get into, is going to engage with this system rationally or just destroy it through terrible social architecture.
Right. And to understand how radical that shift in perspective is, we have to start exactly where the text starts, because it doesn't actually begin with the environment or the cosmos, does it?
No, it doesn't. It begins by establishing a highly specific, uncompromising biological baseline of the human organism itself. This is in verses 12 through 14.
Okay, so what is that baseline?
Well, the source points out that the physical human body develops in the womb according to the exact same biological laws as any other animal.
Right, just pure biology.
Exactly. At a purely physical level, the human is an animal. The text uses the term Adam here, and it traces the linguistic root directly to earth or clay. So it is grounding the human entirely in the material world.
So it forces a baseline of pure, unromanticized biology.
Yeah.
But let's clarify the divergence here, because physical evolution gets us to that baseline, but it doesn't finish the job, right?
Right. That's where it gets interesting.
The source uses a fascinating comparison here. If you look at a goat,
The goat analogy.
yeah, a goat is born completely finished.
Yeah.
Its biological programming is essentially factory installed.
Yes,
It
exactly.
requires food and water, sure, but it will live out its entire existence at the maximum level of goatness.
There is no higher state of being for a goat to achieve.
Right. Its hardware and its operating system are the exact same thing.
The human being, however, is born fundamentally incomplete.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the physical body, the atom from the clay, is merely the hardware. When a human is born, their true self, their conscious personality, it doesn't exist in a finished state.
It's just potential.
Exactly. It is nothing but raw potential. The human must actively, consciously build their own self through their choices and actions.
Wow.
And this ongoing, deliberate process of elevating beyond the biological baseline is what the text refers to as kalkan akar. That translates directly to another creation.
So you are essentially tasked with creating your own operating system.
That is the perfect way to put it. You are writing the code for your own operating system.
But let me push back on how this has historically been interpreted, because if the entire goal of human existence in this framework is this rational, conscious self-development,
Right.
it seems entirely at odds with how these texts are usually taught to people.
Oh, completely.
The standard historical narrative usually treats the creator of this system like a cosmic dictator.
Yes. The angry king in the sky.
Exactly. The message is typically, appease the dictator, follow arbitrary rules, or face eternal punishment. How does a framework of terror and appeasement fit into a rational system of self-development?
The short answer is it doesn't fit at all.
Not even a little.
Not even slightly. The Tulu Islam lecture actually spends considerable time dismantling that exact dictator king model.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It argues that when humanity views the creator of the system as an angry monarch, we fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of the universe.
So what are the mechanics, then?
The text argues that Acting ethically or organizing society justly is not about appeasing an angry entity to earn invisible points for a later reward.
Right.
It operates on an objective rule of law. It is indistinguishable from the laws of physics or chemistry.
So it's cause and effect, not crime and punishment.
Precisely that. Think about human biology. When you consume nutritious food, your physical hardware strengthens. When you consume poison, it degrades. The source argues the exact same objective mechanism applies to the human personality, the kalkunakar.
Okay, so doing good actually fortifies you.
Right. Living according to higher rational values, justice, equity, truth, that actively fortifies and solidifies your human personality.
And doing bad?
Violating those values by acting out of pure greed, exploitation, or irrationality actively degrades that personality. The degradation is a natural, baked-in consequence of the action. It's not an arbitrary lightning bolt thrown by a dictator.
This completely recontextualizes the physical world we live in.
It really does.
Because, I mean, the other side of the cosmic dictator coin is usually the mystic escapist route.
Oh yeah, the ascetics.
Right. If you believe the physical world is just a temporary, painful testing ground ruled by a terrifying king, the logical response for so many historical philosophies has been to just check out.
Asceticism, retreating to a cave.
Exactly.
The source material delivers an incredibly sharp critique of that exact mindset. It actually mocks the idea of achieving spirituality by retreating from the world.
Mocks it.
Yeah. It points to ascetics sitting in mud, hanging upside down in wells, or refusing to participate in the economy because they view the material world as an illusion or a trap.
But if the goal is self-development, taking yourself out of the complex, messy material world seems like. I mean, it's like taking a ship designed for turbulent oceans and leaving it in dry dock.
That's exactly it.
You can't test the hull's integrity if it never hits the water.
That is the core argument the source extracts here. The material world is not a trap to escape. It is the exact, perfectly engineered laboratory required to develop the human self.
The laboratory, I love that.
The human personality can only be built by engaging with the complexities, the economics, and the social structures of the material world.
So you have to be in the mud to build the self.
Yes. Abandoning the material world is synonymous with abandoning the only available mechanism for human evolution. You cannot develop the kalkunakar in a vacuum.
Right. Which sets up one of the most jarring structural paradoxes in this entire passage.
Okay, where are we looking?
Well, we've established that the human is hardware meant to develop an advanced operating system by interacting with a material laboratory, right?
Right.
And the passage is about to detail just how incredibly well designed this planetary laboratory is. The water, the agriculture, the transport.
The supply chain?
Exactly. But right before it lists this vast multi-trillion-dollar supply chain verses 15 and 16 hit you with a massive rhetorical pivot.
Oh, the death verses.
Yes. It says, you are going to die and you will be resurrected.
It acts as an absolute framing device for everything that follows.
But from a pure communication standpoint, doesn't that completely kill the momentum?
What do you mean?
I mean, if the goal is to pitch a perfectly engineered world with limitless potential for civilization, leading with, by the way, your existence here is terminal, seems deeply counterintuitive. Why open a pitch about abundance with a reminder of mortality?
Viewed purely through a sentimental lens, it does seem like a total mood killer.
Yeah, exactly.
But through the socioeconomic lens the lecture utilizes, it reveals itself as a masterstroke of social engineering.
Really? How so?
Placing death as the absolute frame before discussing abundance establishes a fundamental economic reality.
Which is?
You do not own this system. You are merely passing through it.
Oh, wow. It's the difference between a tenure model and an ownership model.
Exactly. And the economic implications of mortality are profound when we look at civilizational behavior.
Let's break that down.
Consider how a person or a corporation or a nation-state manages resources if they operate under the delusion that they are permanent owners of the earth.
They just extract everything.
Right. A permanent owner operates with unchecked extraction. They hoard without consequence. They strip mine resources to maximize immediate return because they view the system as theirs to dominate indefinitely.
Because there's no end date for them, conceptually.
Yes. But a person who deeply internalizes their mortality and the concept of accountability that follows it manages the system entirely differently.
They're forced to manage it as a trustee, a temporary steward. If we translate this to the modern corporate world, it's like the difference between a private equity firm that buys a company just to strip its assets, sell off the parts, and leave it bankrupt, versus a family that builds a multi-generational enterprise.
That is a perfect analogy.
The private equity firm acts as an unaccountable owner extracting immediate value, right? But the family acts as a trustee, ensuring the system survives for the next generation.
Exactly. The text is basically handing humanity the keys to a global factory, but starting the orientation by explicitly stating, your contract expires and there will be a comprehensive audit.
There will be an audit. That is such an intense way to frame it.
But it fundamentally alters the incentive structure of how humanity is supposed to operate the machinery. But to fully grasp the weight of this audit, we actually have to examine how the source redefines the concept of resurrection, or balath in the original Arabic.
Right, because the traditional literalist view of resurrection just conjures up images of a graveyard mechanically reanimating.
Zombies, basically.
Yeah, it feels more like a mythological epilogue than an economic audit.
Well, the source performs a really deep linguistic analysis of the root of the word balath. It argues that the original Arabic root does not simply mean waking up from a grave.
What does it mean?
The literal translation is removing obstacles from a path.
Removing obstacles.
Yes. The lecture provides the analogy of a political movement removing a dictatorship, thereby unblocking the path for societal progress.
Wait. If death is just shedding a physical limitation and resurrection is just unblocking a path, doesn't that inadvertently encourage the exact same escapism the text just critiqued?
How so?
Like, why should anyone care about the material world if the ultimate goal is just to shed it and move on?
That is a crucial distinction to make. The self that survives the shedding of the physical body is built entirely from the friction of the material world.
Oh, the kanakonacha.
Right, remember the kapakonhaker. The physical body, the hardware, eventually becomes a constraint to a fully developed personality.
Right.
Death is the necessary unblocking, the removal of that biological obstacle, so that the developed human personality can continue its evolutionary journey in a wider, unhindered dimension.
But what if you didn't develop it?
That's the catch. If you spent your tenure as a trustee acting like a greedy owner, if you degraded yourself by exploiting the material world rather than engaging it ethically, then when the physical body drops away, there is nothing substantial left.
Your operating system is corrupted.
Precisely. You cannot survive the transition.
So the audit isn't a tally of arbitrary sins. It's a structural stress test of the personality you built.
Yeah.
You only get to continue down the unblocked path if you actually built a vehicle capable of traversing it.
Exactly. And with that frame securely in place, the knowledge that we are mortal trustees tasked with developing a higher self, the text finally opens the doors to the factory.
Right, we finally get to the abundance part.
Yes. It begins to detail the preloaded supply chain of the universe.
Let's get into the text itself then, because the language used in these subsequent verses is incredibly precise, completely devoid of the superstition usually attached to ancient texts.
It is remarkably clinical. Look at verse 17, which mentions the 7 paths above. The lecture points out how this portrays a deeply dynamic moving universe. We are dealing with orbits, paths, and continuous motion.
Right. It's a complete rejection of the old clockwork universe model.
Totally.
For centuries, a dominant philosophical idea was that a creator built the universe like a static clock, wound it up, and walked away.
The absentee landlord theory.
Yes. But the text is describing an active, expanding, continuously unfolding system of physical laws.
Which brings the lecture to the first major node of this active supply chain, the baseline requirement for all biological life.
Hydration.
Hydration. Verse 18 states, Insaan al-Samaiman by Qadar, we sent down water from the sky in measure.
Now, a traditional reading often treats rain as a transactional, almost magical superstition, right?
Right. A society experiences a drought, so they perform a ritual or pray for rain, hoping the deity decides to intervene and change the weather.
But the Telluri's Islam source takes an entirely structural angle on this.
It strips away every ounce of superstition. The analytical focus is laser-targeted on the phrase by Qadar.
By Qadar.
Yes, which translates to in calibrated measure or according to a strict law.
So they're not random.
No. The lecture argues this is not a description of a capricious deity deciding to give you a little bit of rain today because you behaved well. It is the principle of law-governed abundance.
Law-governed abundance.
The universe does not overflow randomly. It operates in calibrated quantities.
Think about that. If you are listening to this on your commute right now and it happens to be raining, you aren't just experiencing weather.
No.
According to this framework, you are driving through a highly calibrated global logistics network. The expert in the source literally compares the water cycle to a massive automated desalination plant.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Think about the sheer scale of the engineering. The Earth is covered primarily in undrinkable, highly saline ocean water.
Right.
The text points out the brilliance of the system. The sun acts as a colossal distillation plant. It utilizes thermal energy to evaporate the water, leaving the heavy salts and impurities behind in the ocean.
It produces pure, distilled fresh water at a planetary scale.
Exactly. And then the atmosphere, the pressure systems, and the winds act as automated distribution vessels, clouds, carrying millions of tons of this perfectly distilled water across continents.
To drop it exactly where the terrestrial ecosystems require it.
Yes. And it accomplishes this by Qadar in measured, mathematically precise quantities over the macro cycle of the Earth's climate.
But extraction and distribution are only 2/3 of a viable supply chain.
Right. You need storage.
Exactly. The precision leads right into the very next phrase of the verse, which is, Fa'askanahu fi ard, and we settled it in the earth.
This is a crucial point.
Because think about modern global logistics. If a major retailer orders a massive shipment of inventory and millions of units arrive at their headquarters all at once, but they haven't built a warehouse to store it,
It's a disaster.
that inventory isn't a blessing. It ruins the business. It paralyzes operations and destroys existing infrastructure.
Absolute.
In the same way, if the global desalination plant just dumped water constantly, or if all that water stayed on the surface, it would wash away the topsoil, cause endless floods, and destroy the very agriculture it was meant to sustain.
The resource would become a weapon.
Exactly. The storage mechanism is just as vital as the distribution mechanism.
And that is what the source extracts from the phrase askanahu fi alard. The Earth itself is engineered with a built-in subterranean warehouse system.
The aquifers.
Right. It is specifically designed to absorb and store this fresh water in massive aquifers and water tables.
So the system controls the release of this vital resource so that complex social life and agriculture can survive seasonal shifts and droughts.
The water is banked.
Yeah. So when we pave over wetlands or drain ancient aquifers faster than they can refill, we are actively destroying the warehouse.
We really are.
We are taking a perfectly engineered system and breaking it, turning rain into destructive flooding because the earth can no longer absorb it.
So we have the dynamic universe, the automated desalination plant, and the subterranean storage infrastructure. The raw utilities are fully operational.
Right.
Having established that foundation, the text moves to verses 19 through 22, outlining what we can essentially call the nodes of production.
The nodes of production. Let's look at the list.
It lists very specific items: gardens, date palms, grapes, the olive tree from Sinai, and finally, cattle and ships.
Now, if we are reading this as an economic blueprint, we cannot treat these as random items thrown into a poem for aesthetic flavor, right?
No, absolutely not. This is a highly specific nutritional and logistical matrix. Dates and grapes aren't just sweet fruits. In the context of human biology and ancient economies, they represent high-density caloric and fast-acting sugar inputs.
They are immediate transportable energy.
Exactly. And the olive tree, specifically highlighting Sinai, perhaps hinting at optimal growing conditions or its role in early trade networks, that provides essential fats and oils.
Which are crucial for brain development, cellular health, and preserving other foods.
And then the text transitions from agriculture to livestock and transport. It mentions cattle, but crucially adds the phrase, lakum fiha manafi kathira. In them are many benefits.
Right, it is not just about meat.
No. Cattle represent a renewable protein source in the form of milk. They provide heavy labor for plowing fields, multiplying agricultural output. They provide leather for shelter and clothing.
And finally, ships.
Ships, which represent human ingenuity utilizing the preloaded physical laws of buoyancy and wind to create global transport and trade networks.
So when you look at it structurally, you have water, carbohydrates, essential fats, renewable proteins, labor multipliers, and logistics.
The universe has handed humanity a fully equipped, turnkey production network.
Which brings the Tolui Islam lecture to its core socioeconomic thesis.
Okay, here we go.
And it's a thesis that completely flips how traditional economics views human history.
Lay it on us.
Because the universe has demonstrably provided the full, perfect input stack for civilizational prosperity, the logical conclusion is that civilizational failure is never a resource problem.
Never.
Never. It is always unequivocally an architecture problem.
Okay, let me challenge this. Because modern economics is literally defined as the study of scarcity.
Yes, that is a foundational assumption.
The assumption is that human wants are infinite, but resources are inherently finite. Are you saying, or is the text arguing, that inherent scarcity is a myth?
The text is arguing that inherent scarcity, in terms of the baseline resources required for the entirety of humanity to thrive, does not exist in the design of the system.
Wait, really?
Yes. The baseline is abundant. What exists and what plagues human history is manufactured scarcity.
Manufactured scarcity.
The source highlights a very specific linguistic detail to prove this point. When outlining these nodes of production, the Quran uses the Arabic word lakum.
Which means?
It translates to for you all in the collective plural.
Oh, wow. So it is not for the strongest among you, or for the elites, or for those who happen to claim the land first.
Exactly. It is a collective species-wide provision.
Therefore, if a society mismanages this provision, if an elite class hoards the water rights, or monopolizes the cattle, or restricts trade in the date and oil markets to drive up prices artificially,
They are manufacturing their own scarcity.
the system was designed to provide for the collective.
Right. So if a single person goes hungry, the text argues, it is not because the global desalination plant failed to produce water or the earth failed to produce calories.
It is because the social distribution network, the architecture designed by human beings, has failed the objective standard of the system. You know, we can look at concrete historical examples of this. Take the Irish potato famine in the 1840s.
That's a perfect example.
The common narrative is that a blight destroyed the potato crop and people starved because there wasn't enough food.
Right. A resource problem.
But historical records show that during the height of the famine, Ireland was producing and exporting massive amounts of grain, meat, and dairy to England.
The land was producing abundant calories.
Abundant. The people starved because the social architecture, the British colonial system of land ownership and export mandates, manufactured the scarcity.
Exactly.
It was a failure of the human architecture, not a failure of the material laboratory.
That is a devastatingly clear example of what the text is diagnosing. And it brings us to the most vital law in this entire framework, what the source calls mikafat iamal.
Mukafat Eamal, the law of requital.
Yes.
Now, when people hear a phrase like law of requital, the immediate modern parallel is karma, right?
Yeah, that's usually the go-to.
You know, a vague mystical sense that what goes around comes around, usually dealt out by the universe in some invisible, poetic way.
The lecture explicitly warns against reading it that way.
How should we read it?
Mukafat iamal is not a mystical, spiritual balancing scale. It is immediate material physics applied directly to sociology and economics.
Okay, give me a socioeconomic equivalent of how this works in practice, because we understand the ecological version, right? If you strip mine a forest, the topsoil erodes, the water table drops, and your crops fail.
The consequences baked into the action.
Exactly. But how does this apply to social architecture?
Well, consider a modern financial architecture, like the events leading up to the 2008 global financial crisis.
Oh, this ought to be good.
Financial institutions hoarded wealth and created incredibly complex predatory systems, like subprime mortgages, to extract maximum value from the working class.
Right. They operated like owners extracting without limit.
Exactly. The law of requital wasn't a divine lightning bolt hitting Wall Street.
Although some people probably wished for one.
Right. But the actual law of requital was that by extracting all the wealth from the foundational layers of society, they destroyed the very consumer base their entire system relied upon.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The socioeconomic structure simply collapsed under the weight of its own mathematical irrationality. The consequence of the hoarding was baked into the architecture.
It's systems theory. Every action in a complex system has a direct, proportionate consequence that will eventually feed back into the origin point.
Exactly.
If your social architecture violates the baseline rules of the hardware and the environment, if it manufactures scarcity and hoards the collective provision, the system will inevitably crash.
It has to.
Conversely, if you steward the system properly, distributing the abundance fairly and acting as a rational trustee, the system multiplies its output.
Which serves as the perfect transition to the final synthesis of this deep dive.
Okay, let's bring it together.
Because the text does not simply lay out this grand theory of systemic architecture and then just end the chapter. It has built a massive multi-layered argument.
Let's recap the layers. First, verses 12 through 14 define the human organism and its potential to develop the Khalqan Akar.
Right. The operating system.
Second, verses 15 through 22 detail the perfectly balanced ecological and economic system built to sustain and develop that human organism.
Establishing the human as a temporary trustee operating under the objective law of requital.
So the foundation is laid, the abundance of the ecosystem is proven, it is not in question, it is fully on offer.
And then, at verse 23, the text makes a very sharp historical pivot.
What's the pivot?
It brings in the story of Noah.
Noah, wow. Usually we treat the story of Noah as a Sunday school fable.
Right, the animals too, too.
Yeah. A man builds a massive wooden boat to save a pair of every animal from a magical punitive storm sent by an angry dictator god.
But look at where this story is placed structurally. The Quran has just finished mathematically proving that the ecosystem is perfectly designed.
Right.
It pivots to Noah to show what inevitably happens when the human organisms, specifically those who refuse to develop their Khalqan Akar and instead operate out of unmitigated greed, refuse to organize their society rationally.
Oh, I see. So the Tolu Islam source frames the story of Noah as the ultimate historical reality, or like the perfect structural metaphor of systemic civilizational collapse.
Exactly. The true meaning of the flood here is not a magic trick. It represents the inevitable destruction of a society that fundamentally violates the law of requital.
Because the ecosystem, as verses 15 through 22 just proved, was perfectly capable of sustaining them.
The water cycle worked. The agriculture worked.
The only variable that caused the civilization to drown was the flawed, oppressive social architecture of the community itself.
They manufactured their own destruction by failing to act as trustees.
They hoarded the resources, they exploited the vulnerable, they operated as if they were permanent owners without any accountability to the collective.
And eventually, this socioeconomic structure collapsed.
They literally drowned in the consequences of their own systemic failures.
The abundance is never in question. The system is perfect. The failure is always human architecture.
So to synthesize this massive journey we've just taken, we started by looking at the human not as a finished static product, but as a biological baseline with the terrifying and beautiful responsibility to develop a higher self.
Khalqan Akar.
Right. The operating system. We walk through a literal masterclass in cosmic supply chains, moving from dynamic celestial orbits and atmospheric desalination plants to subterranean storage and highly specific caloric and logistical production nodes.
It's an incredible sequence.
And we ended with the ultimate test, the realization that this profound abundance is governed by an objective law of requital, and that civilizational survival depends entirely on how we architect our societies to manage that provision.
And, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises a profoundly urgent question for us today.
I was hoping you'd say that. Where does this leave us now?
Well, especially as we look toward the horizon of our own technological advancement, we live in an era where we have more data, more predictive modeling, and more logistical power than any civilization in human history.
Absolutely.
We have entirely mapped this preloaded supply chain. We know exactly how the water cycle works. We know how to genetically optimize agriculture. We understand the caloric and nutritional needs of the human body down to the molecular level.
We have the hardware and the software specs entirely mapped out.
Yet, despite this unprecedented knowledge, we still manufacture scarcity artificially to maintain power dynamics.
It's insane.
We destroy millions of tons of food to keep market prices high while populations starve. We hoard access to clean water. We treat the planet as if we are its permanent owners, extracting without limit, rather than acting as the mortal trustees this text demands we be.
Because we refuse to acknowledge the audit.
Right. But consider a potential future, one driven by artificial intelligence and advanced automation.
Okay, let's go there.
What happens if technology eventually forces a true post-scarcity economy? What if AI and robotics solve all our material production problems, giving us virtually infinite dates and cattle?
That's the ultimate paradox, isn't it?
How do you mean?
If the struggle for baseline resources is completely eliminated by technology, but we haven't actually developed the Khalqan Akar, if we haven't built a human personality capable of rational, ethical existence without the friction of mere survival, our society might still collapse.
That's exactly it.
We wouldn't drown in a lack of resources. We would drown in a crisis of purpose.
The text suggests that the architecture of the human soul is just as critical as the architecture of the food supply.
Right.
If you remove the physical friction, but the operating system is still programmed for greed and exploitation, the civilization will find a new, perhaps far more devastating way to manufacture its own flood.
Wow. So if you are looking at your own industry, your own community, your own society right now, are you building an architecture that distributes the inherent abundance of the system? Or are you just hoarding the water while the rest of the ecosystem prepares for a flood?
That is the question.
Are we actually building the Kalkanakar, or are we just goats in a very technologically advanced, rapidly collapsing pen?
It's something we all need to ask ourselves.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking past the surface level of these ancient texts, because when you strip away the sentimentality and the superstition, you might just find a highly rational, uncompromising system operating right underneath, daring you to engage with it.